Okay, it is that time. Is there anybody here who doesn't know Dick Rohrbaugh? All right, it's all yours. I was just saying to Tom, I seem to be in teaching mode. Yesterday, I was in Albany at the biggest fly fishing show in America, teaching people to tie flies. I'm doing this today, and later I've got to teach a woodworking class. It's out of control, folks, and I'm too old.
Obviously not.
So, last week we talked about religion and politics. And sadly, we had ended the story by acknowledging that even though the Corinthian style of accommodating themselves to life in the Roman world kind of won the day, in the long run, the Roman culture Romanized Christianity to the point where it became simply a tool of the state. Today we're going to take on another one of the culture wars. I think it's fair to say that immigration and multiculturalism are among the hot button issues of the coming election. Multiculturalism is under attack big time. Where Mary and I live in the summer in Montana, people in that rural part of America are livid over the immigration among peoples from other cultures and other places. As they see it, that kind of multiculturalism is killing the American way of life. And so it's become a hot button issue, and one that, interestingly, early Christians also faced. So that's what we're going to look at today. I don't know, it's interesting. This is not the first time this has happened in American history. Think about all the troubles the Irish had coming here, and then all of the troubles the Italians had coming here. So multiculturalism has been an ongoing issue that periodically boils to the surface throughout American history. And actually, it isn't hard to discover the fact that it's been with us as long as human communities have existed. Multiculturalism was alive and well in the Roman world, and we're going to talk about that a little more in a minute. Now, last week we had to tell a little bit of a backstory about what we call acculturation. When Christianity arrives in a culture, inevitably it has to adapt. People wouldn't understand it. It came from a different time, a different culture. They were not Americans. The Bible was not written for Americans or about Americans. But that kind of acculturation has been a huge danger to the church. Today, we have to talk about another backstory before we can jump into multiculturalism. That is the fact that you and I live in what social psychologists will tell you is the most individualistic culture that has ever existed on the earth. The two societies today in which that is true are the US and Australia. But we get the honors. We are the most individualistic culture in almost all of human history. So for us, we value autonomy. We value independence. We value individualism. For most Americans, what happened? What happened? time out.
Just a minor technical difficulty. There you go. Laptop has been individualistic.
Most Americans believe that every human individual is unique. And when we talk about our uniqueness, we start talking psychology. We talk about the fact that each individual has their own values, their own sense of freedom, their own sense of autonomy. They imagine that who they are internally, psychologically, differs from every other person. It never does completely, but the fact that we believe that it exists, and it probably does among us, is something we treasure a great deal. So, personal freedom, choice in matters of belief, are very important to us. We even think of religion as an individual, personal choice. You might be surprised to know that that's almost unique in the world. But it's certainly a part of the American way of life. Things that are personal matter to us as individuals, and if you're not like me, so be it. It's not a problem. However, the world in which the Bible was written was not an individualistic world. They were what social psychologists call a collectivist society. Technical term is a dyadic society. We won't mess with that. Just think of a collective sense of being a human being. All right? The New Testament was born in that world. Early Christianity was born in that world. Most of the collectivist world, even today, considers individualism a moral flaw. I can tell you from the time Miriam and I lived in the Middle East, they considered a serious moral evil. The New Testament was written in that kind of world. Now, there were two groups in antiquity that had some measure of a particular type of individualism. One was the wealthy Roman elite. They were well off enough, rich enough, they could do what they damned well pleased, and they didn't care what you thought. That said, they still had this underlying current of a collective understanding of being a human being. The other people in antiquity that had some measure or sort of individualism were what historians call the expendables. The poor, the lame, the blind, the lowest of the low in the society. And the reason is because they had no family. They had no group to which they belonged. They had no resources. That meant they were on their own because they had no choice. But those two exceptions aside, people in antiquity, including every single writer of the New Testament, was in social psychological terms a collectivist. And here's what we mean by that. What is unique and what matters is not you, it's the group to which you belong. Your family, some kind of an association, your brotherhood, your group, because the group is going to define your identity, define who you are. The focus in antiquity was not on oneself. All members of a group were expected to have exactly the same characteristics, exactly the same beliefs, and exactly the same sort of sense of who they are. Your identity came from the group or groups of which you are a part. Now, in that kind of a collectivist society, personal opinions don't matter. In fact, you would never dare to express them publicly. Because everybody is expected to conform to the values, beliefs, attitudes, outlook, and behavior of the group. One of the interesting results of that was that in collectivist society, nobody keeps secrets inside a group. Outside your group, you can lie, you can cheat, you can do anything. But inside your group, none of that can exist. Miriam and I had an interesting example of this living in the Middle East. You live in a village, one of the things that happens when the sun comes up in the morning, everybody opens all the windows and doors in their houses. And that's sort of a symbolic way of saying, folks, I have no secrets. Everything I am and everything I have is open to everybody in the group. It even creates kind of an interesting thing. People wander in and out of each other's houses. Particularly the children do it. So you have to be fully transparent inside the group, totally secret and obscure outside the group. All right? It's very interesting. There are no psychologists in the Middle East. It doesn't matter. They are not introspective. They don't look inward. They have no sense of who they are as an individual, and they don't know you as an individual. All they know is where is the groups you are part of. That's what matters. One of the most interesting things to me is that even religion in antiquity was not a matter of personal belief. It was a matter of the group you belonged to. You were either part of that group and its religion, or you weren't part of that group. So they didn't know each other psychologically, they didn't know themselves psychologically, they were not introspective. They didn't really know anything about psychological development, and they didn't care. That's irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is, are you growing into being a member of the group? So the modern identity question is, who are you? And if I asked you that, you would begin to tell me about what you value, what you dream, what you hope for. It might not be the same as the other members of your family. I guarantee you in my family it ain't the same. So our question is, who are you? The question in antiquity is, where are you from? Who's your family? What groups do you belong to?
Have we moved in the last 10 years politically in that direction? I mean, we talk about individualism, but as I look at what happens in Congress and Senate and the religious groups that are, I mean, it's sort of like we are enemies. I no longer care about you as an individual. Are you a Republican? Are you a Democrat? Have we started moving in that direction?
We have. It goes like this in American history. We have times, places, and periods of time in which this collective sense of identity rears its head. But in the end, at base, I may be a member of a given political party, but if I don't like what they say, the hell with them. So in that sense, we revert to our bottom line. And our bottom line is, I got my own ideas, pal. Okay? So that's the way they thought about people in antiquity. And that produces some very interesting results. They stereotyped people. And they did it with group identifiers. So, for example, you will read in the Bible, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, the reason he's referred to that way is, if you tell me you're from Nazareth, I know what you believe, I know what you value, I know how you're going to act and how you're going to interact with me. All I need to know is, you're from Nazareth, I got it. Or Saul of Tarsus. That's going to turn out to be significant in our story a little bit later. That tells you where he's from, so you know everything there is to know about him. James, the son of Alphaeus. What they do with that kind of an identifier is, if I know your old man, I know you. You better be exactly like him, or you are no longer part of this family. All right? So these kind of identifiers are what are typical of collectivist societies. Now, you often read in their literature, read them expressing this kind of thing. Here are examples. This is from the book of Titus. Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, and lazy gluttons. You got it? Now, if you're dealing with a Cretan, you know exactly how you have to act. Because they're all that way. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Jesus of Nazareth. That's what Nathaniel says in the Gospel of John. Here's one from a Latin document. Knowing one, lying Greek, you know them all. So if you're dealing with Greeks, assume they're lying. It's the way they all are. Now, some of these stereotypes in antiquity were pretty negative. Try this one. I thank fortune that I was born a human being and not a slave. Think about that. A human being, not a slave. A man and not a woman. We're going to talk about that one next week. A Greek and not a barbarian. Here it is in a Jewish writer. 3 blessings you have to pray every day. Blessed art thou who did not make me a Gentile. Or a woman. Or an uneducated hick. So that kind of group identity stereotyping was a fact of life in everyday life in antiquity. So what that meant was, your group is your identity is your group. If you change your group, you change your identity. Now think about conversion to Christianity and what that meant. All right? To change identity is to change group. To change group is to change identity. So, here are a couple of examples of how people thought about this in terms of religion. In the book of Acts, we have a story where, after listening to the preaching of Paul, a woman named Lydia converted to Christianity. What happened? Lord opened her heart. She was baptized with her household. There has to be no question about this, folks. If you are a Christian, your family is Christian. And if they're not, you're not. Here's another example. Philippian jailer. They spoke the word of the Lord to him, and he was baptized at once with all his family. Do you think all his family sat there and figured out what they were going to convert to? Not the way it happened. What your identity is what your group is what your identity is. And we have to take all of that into account when we think about multiculturalism. Because if your family is Greek and your family is Roman, do you understand we have a problem here? Early Christians found this to be enormously difficult because it meant that they were changing their beliefs. It changed their group and it changed their identity. And what that meant was that if you're a Greek family and you become Christian, you automatically introduce tension between you and the rest of your Greek friends. That kind of tension, often out in open hostility, was also a fact of life in the ancient world. So we're going to try to think about multiculturalism in light of the fact that they were a collectivist society. Immigration. Let's talk about immigration. Immigration in the Roman world was both voluntary in many cases and involuntary in a whole lot more cases. So voluntary immigration occurred for almost exactly the same reasons it does today here. People lose their jobs, their livelihood, they lose their land. war-torn areas, economic survival, those kind of things that drove people to try to find a life somewhere else. And that meant that there was a good deal of, because these cultural areas were very small in antiquity, that meant that there was a good deal of cultural mixing going on. It was voluntary. But overwhelmingly, the immigration to the ancient world was involuntary. And it was the result of war. I should say about voluntary immigration. This is interesting. More Jews lived outside Israel in Jesus' day than lived inside Israel. They had actually migrated to all parts of the Roman world, sometimes very successfully, sometimes not so. It's going to go to pot here in a minute. And we're going to talk about the hostility between Jews and Romans. But there were Romans living all over. I think there were something like 11 million of them living across the Roman Empire, and 4 million of them in Israel. So that kind of multiculturalism had been voluntary. But involuntary, war, famine, loss of land, that was more common. Well, here's an example of that. After the Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 72 and the second one in 132, 135, 40 to 50,000 Jews were involuntarily scattered around the Roman world by force. Those wars ought to tell you that the happy multiculturalism between Jews and Romans was breaking down. Actually, Jews were forbidden to live in the city of Jerusalem. They kicked all of the Jews out of Jerusalem. They renamed it Aelia Capitolina, a Roman name, and forbid any Jew to enter it. Jews did not again become a majority in Jerusalem until 1948. The lower classes of most cities of the Roman world were made up of what you and I would call refugees. That is, non-inheriting sons. No room for them to inherit the land. They drift to the cities. Widows, orphans, people who lost contact with the family, and slaves. Think about this. In the time of Jesus, 280,000 slaves were inhabitants of the city of Rome. 40% of the population. Jews are an example. After the Roman War, thousands of them were brought to Rome. Jews were not allowed to live inside the city. They lived outside across the Tiber River in an area called Trans-Tiberinium, which was basically an open sewer. It was a slum. And something like 40,000 Jews lived there. So that kind of shifting of populations as the result of war was a characteristic throughout the life of the Roman Empire. 90% of the population of cities were these kind of voluntary and involuntary immigrants. That's going to become again significant when we talk about Christianity. So, what about refugee populations? Not all, but in most and many of the Greek cities of the Eastern Roman Empire, that's where Christianity spread the book first. Not so fast in the Latin world of the Western Empire, but Christianity spread very quickly in the Greek-speaking cities of the Roman Empire. They had two legal categories. One in Greek parakoi, we translate that resident aliens, were people who had migrated voluntarily or involuntarily to another city, had lived there for a long time. Legally, they were allowed to live in those cities, but they could not own property and they couldn't vote. Aristotle, for example, was a parakoi, a resident alien of the city of Athens. And he couldn't own property and he couldn't vote. The second one, par epidemoi, we translate visiting strangers. Those are people coming into the cities in rather large numbers on a regular rotating basis. Part of the reasons that even though there's this influx of people who lost land, lost contact with families, non-inheriting sons, and so on, the reason when they come in the cities didn't grow was because the death rates were so high. But 90% of the population of cities was this kind of folk. And they are called par epidemoi, visiting strangers. They were allowed to live in the cities they migrated to, but if there was a war, the gates were closed and they were booted out. Now, what's interesting to me is that the letter of 1 Peter in your New Testament is addressed to the parakoi and par epidemoi of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. In other words, a widespread area in the Greek-speaking eastern part of the Roman Empire. That's a little clue, folks, as who the Christian population was. Okay? They are visiting strangers, and some of them resident aliens, but they're not the people who lived in the city all the way along and who were citizens. So, there was a problem for these people. If you are a widow who lost connection to your family, or an orphan, and you drift into a city, you have no land to farm now, you have no other way of making a living, and you drift into a city, what would be the first thing you would try to do? You try to get into some kind of group, right? A trade guild, an ethnic group. What happened with all this population shifting going on in the Roman world was, if you spoke a Cretan language, where would you go in the city you ended up in? You'd go find other Cretans, right? So in these cities, there was a Jewish quarter, a Latin quarter, a Christian quarter, a Tiberian quarter. That is to say, one of the first things you would do, find people like yourself that you could be part of the group. Or a trade guild or a club, and there were clubs and trade guilds of all kinds in the Roman world, made up often and largely among people who had to find some kind of a group when they ended up in a strange city. Well, what if you don't make it? One of the demographic historians of the ancient world has estimated that a man who found himself now in a strange city, who did not make it into a group, had a life expectancy of 1.5 years. A woman had a life expectancy of 6 months. You understand, living in a collectivist society was difficult. So, at the end of the day, a result of all of this mixing going on was two things. First, the cities of the Greco-Roman world were among the most multicultural that have ever existed on the planet. They had a greater mix of populations than we do by far. Multiculturalism was a fact of life in the Roman world. The second result, ethnic tensions would do the roller coaster thing. For a long period of time, in some areas of the Roman Empire, this multiculturalism worked very well. People got along and it was no difficulty. But in other areas, tension would break out. And one of the realities that early Christianity had to face was that in all of the centuries of antiquity, the largest and most serious breakdown of multicultural contentment was in the 1st century. And most of that breakdown began with the hostility between Jews and Romans. That, as you know from what we talked about last week, resulted in riots against Jews in Antioch. They burned their synagogue. Many of them died. There were riots in the year 38 against Jews in Alexandria. And as that hostility began to grow, it eventually resulted in the Jewish-Roman War of 66, and a second one in 132, the net bottom line of which was that it virtually destroyed anything we could recognize as ancient Israel. So for better or worse, Christianity developed in a century and in a segment of the Roman Empire in which multiculturalism was breaking down. So our question is going to be, how did the Christians respond? Okay? So, well, that's what I just talked about. There are other examples of it too. When you read the New Testament, it's pretty clear that there was animosity between Samaritans and Israelites. You remember the story of the Samaritan woman or the Good Samaritan and so on. So there are stories about it. But it's very interesting that the Gospel of John is the only book in the New Testament that has a story in it about the conversion of Samaritans to Christianity. The Samaritan woman at the well. That's a good indication that the Johannine Christian community was multicultural. Jews and Samaritans. Okay? We also know that there was a good deal of hostility among Jews and Gentiles, as they call them in the ancient world, over eating. Jews would only eat kosher food. It was not a law. It was never in the Torah, and it was never a Jewish law. But it was without doubt a hardcore Jewish value that they did not sit at the same table with Gentiles. They would not eat Gentile food. Paul, we're going to talk more in a minute about his multiculturalism. Paul argued that Christianity should be available to Gentiles without becoming Jews first, being circumcised. And so a dispute developed between Peter and Paul. Paul, a Hellenized, multicultural Jew, and Peter, a hardcore local product of Israel. A dispute developed between them about whether or not those Gentiles coming into the Christian community had to, like their Jewish counterparts, follow the kosher laws. That dispute got kind of heated. Eventually, a big council in the year 49 was called among Christians in Antioch, and they tried to work out a settlement with some success. So, if we think about how did Christians handle that level of multiculturalism, it's really fascinating that early on, they clearly pulled it off. And they did in a couple of ways and for a couple of reasons. But I want to show you some of the evidence. In the book of Acts, yes?
Did the adoption of Christianity increase life expectancy because it gave them proof for those that were multicultural?
Without any doubt. Absolutely.
And also the breakdown of multiculturalism, the adoption of Christianity, is that also dependent by the way?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
But that was a good insight, Chris. It did increase life expectancy. And I'm going to show you how in a minute. Okay? But here in the book of Acts, at the day of Pentecost, all these languages are being spoken. That's a clear attempt by the writer to indicate to you that Christianity itself was multicultural. Okay? Look at the letters of Paul. Paul, I'm going to have to talk more about this later, but one of the most amazing things that early Christianity did was Christians formed surrogate families. What did they call each other? Brother and sister, right? Where does your identity come from? You understand? There is no indication in the letters of Paul that those small house church congregations who thought of themselves as surrogate families had difficulties with multiculturalism. So, I've already talked about the Samaritan woman. That's an indication that it was a multicultural community that used the Gospel of John. We also learn in the book of Acts that after they held this big council, they settled the disagreements between Jews and Gentiles over eating, and with some success. And they were able to eat at table together. There's some very interesting new research about what happened in Antioch when the anti-Jewish riots broke out. And the indication is immediately Jewish and Greek Christians stopped eating together. Paul makes what has got to be one of the most amazing statements to come out of antiquity. In Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek. Think about that in a collectivist world. That distinction disappears in Paul's mind. In Christ there is no Jew or Greek. Paul is interesting because Paul is a hybrid. Paul is Jewish. He's born Jewish. But he lived in Tarsus, a large Greek city, where the language was Greek. And Paul's native language is Greek. So he sort of was used to multiculturalism and comfortable with it, and imagined Christianity would expand that kind of thing. Paul goes to great length in his writings to talk about how there is one Lord and one gospel for everybody. So I think it's fair to say that initially, Christianity was an attempt to get past multiculturalism, to create multicultural communities in which Jew and Greek and Cretan and Cyprian and all of them could imagine themselves as brother and sister. But the problem was it didn't last. In fact, it didn't last very long. Wasn't very long before hostilities, tensions, ethnic tensions began to develop as Christianity spread. So, if you go to seminary, one of the things you got to do is take a course in church history. And what you do is you learn all about the theological disputes in the early church. Don't be fooled, folks. That theological rhetoric is a guise for multicultural tension. So what we begin to see is theological language of dispute. But the dispute is really hostilities between different cultural Christian groups. And there's good evidence of it. Even in Paul, we begin to hear talk about false teachers and rogue leaders of other groups. And Paul is upset by it, and that's when he declares there is one gospel and one Lord for everybody. But it wasn't very long before those disputes became an absolute avalanche. And the multicultural harmony broke down. In other writers, Clement, Ignatius, like all this list of guys, they spilled enormous amounts of ink trying to declare Christian unity. You can understand, you don't bother declaring it and insisting on it unless it doesn't exist, or it's in trouble. The amount of ink they spilled on this subject is enormous. We know of tensions that began to develop between Christian groups in different cities. So there was very early on serious rivalry and competition between the Christians in Alexandria and Egypt and Antioch, what is now Syria. Then it wasn't very long before there was major hostility between the church in Alexandria and the cities of Upper Egypt that were native Egyptian, whereas Alexandria was native Greek. So that kind of rivalry between Christians in different cities, meaning different cultural areas, just exploded in the 2nd and 3rd century. Here's examples. There was always, from the very beginning, tension between the group that used the Gospel of John and other Christian groups. And it's pretty obvious why. If you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the story is virtually 3 versions of the same story. You read the story in John, it's totally different. Totally different. For example, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is in Jerusalem once. In John, he's there 3 times. Wholly different teachings. The parables, for example, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't appear in John. The stories in John don't appear in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that's an indication that the Johannine group was separate, had their own version of the Jesus story, and other Christians didn't like it. And we know that they eventually fled Israel. It probably originated in Galilee. They fled Israel, went to Syria, likely ended up in Egypt. And in the year 384, the Bishop of Rome banned the Gospel of John. So, more evidence of the breakdown. There was a centuries-long tension between what came eventually to be called Orthodox Christianity and Gnostic Christianity. By the 4th century, that had broken out in warfare. I don't mean symbolic warfare. I mean, they were killing each other. So ethnic, culturally specific versions of Christianity in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century began to spread throughout the Roman world. Caused no end of difficulty. When Constantine declared Christianity the religion of the empire, you understand, folks, that was political. What he did was he was trying to use Christianity to unite the empire. It was crumbling and falling apart because multiculturalism was rearing, anti-multiculturalism was rearing its head. So early Christians tried a variety of strategies to get away from this. This is how you should read what was called the monastic movement, moving to monasteries. In other words, we can't fight it, we'll leave it. This is the way you should understand what we call hermit Christianity. The word hermits, there was a guy named Simeon Stylites. That means Simeon on a pole. This guy sat on top of a pole for 40 years. 40 years. I went to see his pole. I couldn't believe it. I've seen it. It was about 12 feet high, it was about 6 feet in diameter, and he lived up there 40 years. People brought him food and so on. But symbolically, think what he's doing. He's trying to rise above it. You understand? Hermits lived out in the desert. Get rid of all this crap that's going on. Just live out there. The movement was very successful in the long run, but it was attempts to try to get away from all this stuff. There's a very interesting way to get evidence for the sheer diversity of early Christianity. You're familiar with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I think Steve Patterson did a class on the Gospel of Thomas, did he not? A lot of people are aware that there was a Gospel of Thomas. You know how many, think about it this way too, because the Gospel of Mark was originally the Jesus story in a given community. They never heard of you or your community because you used the Gospel of Luke. Eventually they got together. But think of a gospel as the version of the Jesus story told in a particular cultural group. Well, how many gospels do you think there were in early Christianity? Are you ready? I've got a list. We're Gnostic gospel. Oh, I forgot one bunch. I got to talk about him too. A group called the Marcionites. Their leader was a guy named Marcion. They dumped the Old Testament to Jewish. They dumped most of the Gospels. The only thing they would use was an edited version of the Gospel of Luke. They took the Jewish sounding stuff out of it. So there's a total break with Jewish Christianity. It's a good example of the multicultural breakdown that occurred. But let's look at the Gospels. We got Gnostic Gospels. You ever hear of all of these? How many of you knew there was a Gospel of the Egyptians? Jewish Gospels. How many of you knew that there were strictly Jewish Christian Gospels? The Gospel of the Ebionites I've used in some of the writing I've done. There were infancy Gospels. These are really interesting. They tell lots of stories about the childhood of Jesus. Were any of them historical? We don't know. But they're very interesting. One of these Gospels, the Syriac infancy Gospel at the bottom, that's a part of the canon of the Bible in Syrian Orthodox Christianity. And it tells the story of the birth of Mary. Another gospel. Then we have a lot of partially preserved gospels. They're fragmentary. We only have fragments of them. Gospel of Peter is an example. It is a very different crucifixion story than the one we have. A lot of fragmentary gospels preserved in primary sources. What we mean by that is other writers would quote the Gospels, just like preachers nowadays quote Scripture. Ancient writers quoted Scripture, but they quoted Gospels we didn't know about. And so there have been a lot of them preserved that way, quite a few of them. Then there are ones that we can reconstruct from commentaries. You know, I could write a commentary on the book of Luke, and in process of which I quote it. We have commentaries by early Christian writers. We don't have the Gospels, but we have the quotes. Then we have a lot of lost Gospels. And what I mean by a lost Gospel is ones we don't have a quote from, it doesn't exist anymore, but it's named by other early writers. He says, when I was reading the Gospel of Barnabas, I thought about this, but he didn't quote the darn thing. But the fact that he names it indicates that it once existed. How many are there, folks? There are 45. I don't know if my list is complete. That's the list I can put together quickly. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that early Christianity was multicultural in the extreme. There were widespread, disparate groups of early Christians, each of whom had their own version of the Jesus story. Some survived, some did not. So, it would be right to say there was no Christianity on day one. There were Christianities plural on day one. Think about this. It wasn't long before there was Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox, that's an African one, Roman Catholic, and dozens of other ethnic Christianities. And if you read the history of that period, because once Christianity became the empire's religion, the governors of local areas became the bishops. And it wasn't long before bishops of one area were excommunicating the bishops of those other jerks over there. So it's very clear that this unity simply did not last. And of course, folks, this kind of ethnic Christianity still is. Think about this. The French and Italians are Catholic, Germans and Scandinavians are Lutheran, Brits are Anglican, Scots are Presbyterian. I don't know how many of you know that there is a Korean Presbyterian church in our presbytery right here. More than one? Yeah, and they speak Korean. We don't have a lot in common with them because of that language barrier. You're aware of the fact there are 250 denominations in the United States? I think the unity thing is in a little trouble. Now we've got one going on that is positively appalling. We have evangelical Christians in a concerted effort to create a white, culturally European Christian ethno-state. Well, under religious right. Talk about a violation of what Paul tried to get across. That was just appalling to me. Now I want to summarize this though by saying what I think are the two most precious things that came out of early Christianity, that we need to work hard to revive and value in our individualistic world. The first of those was the tendency to form surrogate families. They rescued lost, frightened people. They called that salvation. You understand? Remember how long you live if you didn't make it into a group in a city? That's one of the most precious things in the entire New Testament. Forming a family of people. I don't care where you're from. I don't care what language you speak. I don't care if you're rich or poor, sister. And the second thing is Paul's effort to create a multicultural body of Christ. In Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek. Those two things are, in my mind, the heart of the gospel. And it's sad that it hasn't fared very well. Lasted for a while, lasted longer in some places than others, but it broke there. It's a hard thing to do. We Americans are not really good at it right at the moment. But I think it is the only way, really, to follow the teachings of Jesus. Time out. Questions?
Yeah, the Greeks claim, Greek Orthodoxy claims to be the oldest Christian church, therefore they hire as a Christian church than any other Christians out there.
Yeah, he's pointing out that there's a tendency among Greek Orthodox Christians today, they think of themselves as the oldest Christian church, and that's probably correct, by the way. Because that's where Christianity spread, was in the Greek-speaking world. They tend to be a little bit arrogant about claiming that as a result that they're a little superior to us latecomers. And that's unfortunate, but they are probably the oldest church. Yes.
So how, I'm having trouble understanding why evangelical Christians or biblical liberals can take the Gospels, that says there's neither Jew nor Greek, east nor west. How do they reconcile that?
Yeah, that's really difficult to understand. I grew up in that world, so did Mary. Back when we were in part of that world growing up, though, it wasn't it wasn't political. It has become political in more so in recent times. But you know, they are like us in one respect. That is, they cherry pick the Bible. We do it too. It's almost inevitable. But you know, if you cherry pick the right text, you can. You remember last week we talked about how we tend to Americanize our Christianity. Americans cherry pick the Bible. You'll learn that real quickly if you start working in Christianity among Christians in other cultures. Some of you know that I've been part of a scholarly group that we got folks from cultures all over the world. You try to sit in that group and explain, you know, a Christian version of Christianity, an American version of Christianity, they will come down here in your head real quick. So part of it is the cherry picking problem. But you also need to remember what we talked about last week. When faith marries politics, in the long run, politics wins out. And it's a sad thing. I would like to think in a congregation like Westminster, maybe you're a Republican, maybe you're a Democrat, it doesn't matter here. We are all one. But that's been a really, really hard thing for Christians to maintain. We're more likely to try to maintain something that's congenial to our particular politics. One more.
Do you have a sense of how mass communication, especially since the internet, has changed individuality in collectivist societies in the modern day?
Yeah, and as you pointed out earlier, I sort of overplayed it, to be honest with you, to try to show you the contrast. Every culture has some individual, and every culture, including ours, has some collectivism. There is actually a third type, I'm not going to bore you with all of that social psychologists talk about. There are things that happen in history that tend to elevate one or the other. And I think in some interesting ways, the internet and television have collectivized. But in other ways, they have individualized when we learn about what those SOBs in Russia are doing. So there's always the tension between the two. When you actually live in a village in the Middle East, like Mary and I had, boy, you see it. I mean, we've got a very dear Palestinian friend. She is convinced to the soles of her feet that the moral problems with crime, and she includes divorce, and all of those things in America are the result of individualism. It's morally corrupted. But Americans have enjoyed some of the things of individualism. I do. I'm not like my father. He was a right-wing Republican. I'm not. That doesn't surprise me.
Well, with individualism comes loneliness, and that's an epidemic going on here in America.
Oh, what a good point. He's just said, with individualism comes loneliness. And isn't it true that in our society we still try to find ways to create community? Some of them are bizarre, some of them are successful. So these tensions always exist, but it is in fact true that we remain the most individualistic culture in the world.
And fear plays a big part, I think. Fear of being overtaken by another culture.
Yes.
And maybe that's the religious rights
It
problem.
really does. I had a really funny example of this that occurred once. I was taking a group of high school students with me on a trip to Europe and the Middle East. And we're in a bus, we're in Germany, and we pulled up to a famous tourist site, and there were other tour groups around. And the bus driver said to me, "Look, that group is Germans. That group's American." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Look at the Germans, they're all following each other in line. Look at the Americans, they're paying no attention to the guy, they're scattering." That tells you a little bit about our culture.
I was thinking this week about, I have a daughter-in-law who's Ethiopian, and one time she and my son were driving into a Walmart, and Leonard's son from his first marriage and his wife were driving out. And Hewitt said to my son, "I like America. In Ethiopia, we would have had to stop and have coffee, and here we get to do our errands." But of course, over time, she also feels lonely in America. So to your point, she I was just thinking we glorify one or the other. We say collectivist is good or individual is good, but they both have their good parts and they both have their problems.
Do you think our brains are hardwired to be in groups? Do you think our brains are hardwired to be in groups? This is my group and that's your group, and spiritual, genuine spiritual.
I actually read a very interesting book.
Repeat the question for the people online.
Pardon?
Repeat the question for the people
Oh,
online.
yeah. She has asked, do you think our brains are hardwired to find ourselves in a group? And to some degree, yes, I just read an interesting book on social psychology in which brain researchers have come to the conclusion that if you live that way, your brain will increasingly be wired that way. And so those things tend to perpetuate. So yeah, we probably are. You know, we have enjoyed a lot of benefits in this individualism. There are also benefits there are benefits not only of collectivism, but of stereotypes. We live in an oral society, and neither you and I can read, and I'm doing business with you, and I need to know what kind of person you are. The way you do that is by understanding what group you are. Folks, we have quit. Commercial. Next week, we're going to take on gender wars and try to figure out how did early Christians deal with conflicts between men and women that still exist today.
I've got another ad for you. The Adult Ed Committee is going to be sending out a questionnaire this month and asking you to give your input on the programs that we've been putting on, what programs you might like to see. So stay tuned. That will be available both in paper forms and also in electronic form. So later this month, Adult Ed survey. Thanks.